talk about Virginia Woolf, her life, her work, her manic depressive illness, and finally her suicide. She was an extraordinary lady, as you will see in a moment. Those of you that may not be familiar with her work, though I'm sure everybody knows about Virginia Woolf and possibly have read some of her novels and certainly some of her short stories. She was in many ways a remarkable person, and we will concentrate in certain aspects of her life. You know, you couldn't talk about Virginia Woolf in an hour and 15 minutes. It will take several days to cover her decently. But we are going to concentrate in certain aspects that are of special interest to people in our field. So we will talk a little bit about her life, some about her work, some about her manic depressive illness, and then I will tell you how she decided to commit suicide and how she achieved that. This is who I am, and I think most of you really know me, but as I always say, this is for the sake of the international community. This is Virginia Woolf. As a young girl. You see, she was a very pretty girl. Here she was probably 14, 15 years old. Let me give you some historical data to frame what we're going to do tonight, and we will take it from there. Virginia was born actually on January 25th of 1882. And both her parents, that I will show you a picture in a moment, had previous marriages. Her mother was a widow, and so was her father. They were both have lost their wives. Thus, Virginia was the third child born of her mother's second marriage and her father's second marriage, but they were children of their earlier marriages. This is important, as you will see. There were 3 other children from her mother's first marriage and 1 from her father's first marriage. From the mothers there were Gerald, George, and Stella. Were the children from her first marriage, and the father had a girl called Laura that was a mentally retarded girl, but lived with them at the home. She was an idiot. From their second marriage of both her father and her mother came several children. The first one was Vanessa, which is achieved some notoriety as a painter in England. Then followed Toby, then followed Virginia, our subject tonight. Then followed a gentleman, little boy at the time, for the name of Adrian. Adrian became later on in his life a psychoanalyst. He was a training analyst of the British Psychoanalytic Society. In fact, I got to know him because I trained there. Notice, and this is important, that she was the 7th child in a nursery of 8 children. The younger one being Adrian, the younger sibling, who later became, as I told you, a British psychoanalyst. When she was 13 years, 4 months, her mother died. Practically suddenly, after a very short, brief illness. It was 2 or 3 days and she was gone. She was very healthy before that. There was nothing wrong with her. But in those days, that was not unusual. You could develop some kind of infectious disorder and very quickly develop into septicemia, and you were gone in days. There were no antibiotics. I mean, they don't respect age. You could be 5 years old, 50 years old, it didn't matter. It would kill you in a matter of days. That's what happened to the mother. So this was in May 5th of 1895, and when she died, her half-sister, Stella, the mother's daughter from her first marriage, took the mother's place and became kind of Virginia's mother. She was not a very old lady. She was a young girl herself, but certainly she was an adult, and a few years older than Virginia was. I'm sure that many of you are aware that to lose a parent at this age creates a lot of problems. There are people who have studied this carefully, particularly in Chicago. Teresa Benedict did a lot of research on this area, and it creates enormous problems in development that we sometimes discuss here, but we won't do that today. What I can tell you is that adolescents, like children, cannot mourn the loss of an important object as we do as adults. So that work of mourning can be done. Is they are stuck with the death. And maybe later on in adulthood that may happen. Frequently it doesn't happen, and it creates a large number of significant problems, and you will see some of them in Virginia's life events and things of that kind. Now, a couple of months after her mother's death, which was in 1895, Virginia had her first mental breakdown. So she was hardly 14 years old. She was 13 years, 5 months. It lasted for 2 years and led to the first suicidal attempt, which was serious. She jumped out of a window, but luckily on the second floor, but luckily she was not badly hurt. As you will notice, and I will advance that to you, she had, as I say in the title of the thing, 9 manic depressive illness, and she seemed to have cycles, as sometimes happen with manic depressive patients, that they are like clockwork. Every so many years they develop an episode, and with her it was about every 9 years, it seems. So she was very sick for 2 years, and I mean sick. She was delusional, you name it, she had problems. Now, her mother's substitute, Stella, which was a half-sister, got married 2 years later, that is in 1897, about the time that she recovered, and died 3 months after that marriage. Stella, too, like her mother, died rather quickly and unexpectedly. It will seem, though there is perhaps not enough evidence to draw these conclusions, but the likelihood that she had an ectopic pregnancy and bled to death is very, very large. Now, Virginia's full sister, Vanessa, that's a full sister from the second marriage, but much younger than Stella, then took the position of the mother in the household, right, to mother everybody and to, of course, help her father. There were a lot of children, as you see, there were 8 children in the household. Now, her father, which was a very distinguished literary figure in England, called Leslie Stephen, died 7 years later in 1904. Virginia was by then 22 years old. And let me show you, for a second I will show you Virginia at around the time that the father may have died, shortly thereafter. She, as you see, she's a little older than, that's her father, Leslie Stephen. As I said a moment ago, he was a very distinguished literary person in England, and most of the very notable literary figures of that time were frequent visitors of his home. Now, shortly afterwards, her brother Toby was the one that was just above her, started something called the Thursday's Evening, like, literary groups. This was a very distinguished group of young people, highly educated and with literary minds. And he started what was called the Thursday Evening, of what was to become a very famous group called the Bloomsbury Group. There were a lot of distinguished people in that group. This was the beginning of their careers, and that happened at a place called Gordon Square in London, where they had just moved after the father's death. They left the original home in which they lived. Now, 7 months after her father's death, she had her second serious breakdown. Lasted about 8 months on this occasion. The second suicide attempt took place by jumping out again from a second floor window. Again, she was lucky, not that she didn't suffer any major damage. She's now 22 years and 8 months old. And in 1905, 8 years after the father's death, the whole family went on a trip to Greece in 1905. Vanessa and Toby came back from that trip that included the Middle East and India and I think Greece and places like that, came back to London very, very ill with typhoid fever, which was rampant in those days that they contracted during this trip. Vanessa, her older sister, full sister, recovered, but Toby died. Show you a picture of Toby. That's Toby. Toby was a very distinguished, talented man, very popular. He was in Cambridge. He was a man of enormous talents and enormous sympathy. He was a leader of the group. He had started that Bloomsbury group, kind of tertulias on the Thursday evenings, and people were very attached to him. It was an enormous blow to this group when Toby died. In fact, it cemented the relationship and it lasted a lifetime. And it was all around the figure of Toby, as you will see. Toby was enormously influential on Virginia. He was her, older brother, full brother. And he was very interested in literature, among other things, and encouraged her to write and to read, and taught her some Greek, which, as you will see, will be very important. You will see that in a moment. And so there was a very close relationship between these two, but there was an enormous ambivalence at the same time from Virginia to Toby, in the sense mostly of jealousy, because Toby was going to Cambridge, the university, and having an education, and in those days, even in families like Virginia that were highly educated people, girls didn't have university educations. They were trained to be very gentle and well-spoken, and some housewife to run a household. They usually were taught several languages. They probably were taught some musical instruments and so on. But a university of education, as it was typical of men, was out of the question in those days. So she resented that very badly, and indeed, as you may well know, she became a feminist and fought really hard for changing this situation. Indeed, later on, when she was already a famous writer, Cambridge tried to give her a special prize, literary prize, and she refused to accept it because they only had in the population of the students males. They didn't accept females, and she said, until you have a mixed population, I wouldn't take it. And so that's Toby. Toby was very favored by the father as well, by her father. Now, I have to tell you that though she didn't go to the university, her father took a special interest in her education. As I told you, her father had an extensive library of literary books, books on literature and so on. He was a writer. In fact, he was compiling all the writers of England. It was his job, was a special job that he had. And so he obviously had an enormous bibliography, and he was a good man, loved Virginia, and taught her, really, the art of writing and what she should read. In short, he guided her. He would go to the British Museum, get special books for her, and so she didn't have a formal education, but her father did an enormous amount trying to educate her and follow and develop her interest. Nevertheless, she was very resentful that there was this distinction between Toby and her, and she loved Toby and corresponded with her frequently while he was at the university. This death will have an enormous influence in Virginia's life. In fact, it be all through her life, as you will see in a moment. Now, so I wanted to point out, which I already did, that she had introduced her to writing, to Greek literature, and so they were close. Now, shortly after Toby died, Vanessa married her sister, which was running the household, to a man known by the name of Clive, and that was mostly the result of Toby's death. She wouldn't have married this man at all had her brother not died, but Toby left an empty space, and different people did different things to put a cork in that hole that was left in their lives. So immediately or shortly thereafter, then Virginia married a man by the name of Leonard Woolf. That's why she's Virginia Woolf. She was born as Stephen. And that was too, not very long after Toby's death, and all that was related to it and to her sister Mary. She was left with Eliot. Now, Leonard Woolf is a very distinguished man. He was too a literary figure. He and Virginia founded an editorial house called the Hogarth Press that in the 20s and 30s was probably the most recognized editorial house in the world, had the best stable of writers. And peculiarly enough, it included Sigmund Freud. They published the works of Sigmund Freud. Indeed, the Hogarth Press was the one that published the standard edition of the collected works of Sigmund Freud. These are her parents, that's her father and her mother, and as you see, Virginia looked a lot like her mother, as you can see here. Now, immediately after her marriage, she had another mental breakdown. She attempted suicide. This time she didn't jump out of a window. She took a large dosage of the sedative was used in those days called Veronal, and she took an enormous dosage of it, and she was in a coma for several days, and really she survived by miracle. This was around 1913, and you can see the 9-year cycle again. These are the three things that I particularly want to talk to you this evening. The first one, actually, is the tremendous impact that the death of her mother, her sister Stella, her father, and finally Toby, look how many deaths, one after the other, very shortly after the other, had on Virginia, on her illness and on her writing. The second is the role that writing played in her life. Why did she write? Why did she write when she wrote? And as you will see, it's quite illuminating. And the third, which is obviously linked to the other two, is how her manic depressive illness, that was in fact not diagnosed during her lifetime, but is clearly what she had, influenced her writing in many, many, many ways. In order to accomplish the first aim, we will need to look briefly at the nature of her relationship to her mother, to her father, her brother Toby, and her sister Stella, her half-sister Stella. This is the mother there, as you can see, by the side of the father. And this is what Virginia relationship to her mother looked like, and it's very important. She wrote about this. These are mostly her words, and I will tell you when they are literal quotes. Virginia, like any small child, was hungry for her mother's attention and love. Whatever her mother could give her, and I believe it was as much as she was able to, would not have been enough for Virginia. And remember, there were 7 other siblings in that household. In the circumstances, that probably was not enough to go around anyhow and to fill the large needs of so many people. The mother had 8 children to care for, and remember, Virginia was the 7th. There was a lot of competition for the mother's attention. If you read the life histories of these people, the competition was ferocious. There was a dependent husband, Leslie, which was a very demanding one at that. There was a sick maternal grandmother in Brighton, the mother's mother, that required mother's attention and very frequent visits. And Brighton is some distance from London. You spend the whole day in that. It's not that it is that far, but usually you will spend the day. Then the mother was a nurse, and for some reason she attended to a lot of people that were sick and infirm, and she attended to them and nursed them. There were dozens of letters of needy people to answer that she took care of, Virginia's mother. There were 7 maids in that household that were depending on her to run the household. And in the critical early years of Virginia, there was as well the mother's depression. Virginia mothers have been very depressed, which was due to having lost her first husband, with whom she was passionately in love. In many ways, the marriage to Virginia's father was a marriage of convenience for both of them. But she was madly in love with this husband that she had lost. And then, shortly thereafter, Virginia, Adrian was born, the younger brother, that for some reason became her mother's favorite and passion. The mother was passionate about Adrian, and he bypassed everybody in favor of Adrian. Of course, Virginia resented that tremendously all of her life, and it tainted her relationship to her brother forever. Naturally, given all these factors, Virginia was deeply ambivalent, disappointed, and angry with her mother. Because of this, at some point, she then developed a strong hostility towards her, as well as what were clearly unconscious death wishes. This, of course, made Virginia very anxious and symptomatic. Now, we can infer all the above from the following statements that were made by her in her later life. This is a quote. She said, "I waited in agony, peeping surreptitiously behind the blind for her to come down the street," the mother. "When she has been out late, the lamps are lit, and I am sure that she has been run over. Once my father found me peeping, questioned me, and said, rather anxious but reproving, 'You should not be so nervous, Ginny.'" They call her Ginny. That's the end of quote. So as you see, she had fantasy that the mother had been killed in an accident, turned over by a carriage or a car. This scenario repeated itself very frequently, and for a long time was endured by Virginia, who did not communicate this anxiety and fantasies to anybody. The father just caught her watching in the window, and then she talked about it. Let me call your attention as well to the following comment, which is a literal quote. "And that is my last sight of her. She was dying. I came to kiss her, and as I crept out of the room, she said," the mother said to her, "'Hold yourself straight, my little goat.'" End of quote. She frequently, from thereafter, signed her letters to her sister or friends, "Your loving goat." Lasted a lifetime too. Loving goat. This she wrote, these things, literal quotes that I am reading to you, she are taken from a book that she wrote called Moments of Beings. As you will see, she wrote, there are several volumes of her diary and several volumes of a correspondence with other people. There are novels, and there's an enormous amount of information about Virginia Woolf, and she wrote very openly about herself. Many years later, Virginia wrote the following. That was in May 28, 1939, about the time when her half-sister Stella had taken her to kiss her mother for the last time. She wrote about that occasion, which was many years earlier. She wrote, and this is a quote, "When I kissed her, it was like kissing cold iron." I don't know if you ever kissed a dead person. If you haven't had a close relative that you have kissed, it's a way of saying goodbye. That's a beautiful description of it. It's exactly what you will feel in your lips. Cold iron. Whenever I touch cold iron, the feeling comes back to me, the feeling of my mother's face, iron cold and granulated. I startled back. Then Stella stroked her cheek and undid the button of her nightgown. She always liked it to have it like that, she said. When later on she came up to the nursery, she said to me, "Forgive me. I saw you were afraid." She had noticed that I had startled. When Stella asked me to forgive her for having given me that shock, I cried. We have been crying on and off all day, and said, and this is a quote, "When I see Mother, I see a man sitting with her." That's when she saw the mother there. Stella looked at her as if she had been frightened by this statement. "Did I say that," says Virginia, "in order to attract attention to myself? Or was it true? I cannot be sure, for certainly I had a great wish to draw attention to myself. But certainly it was true that when she said, 'Forgive me,' and thus made me visualize my mother, I seemed to see a man on the edge of the bed." And this is a quote now from what Stella says. It is nice that what Stella told her as a reaction to this comment. It is nice that she shouldn't be alone. Stella said after a moment of pause to Virginia, talking about her mother's depression and immense unhappiness after her first husband's death, she said, this is a quote, "Stella once told me that she used to lie upon his grave at Orchard Lake," which is the cemetery. "As she was undemonstrative, that seemed a superlative expression of her grief." This woman, as I told you, was extraordinarily attached to that man. On the account that follows now, one can see as well the ambivalence toward her mother, her Oedipal rivalry, and the typical adolescent denial and reversal of affect she was using. Children and adolescents, when they lose a close relative like the mother or the father, you use a lot of reversal of affect. In fact, they may run into the street laughing, "My mother died, my mother died," rather than crying, which shocks everybody, but it's what they do frequently. So, while she was describing the event of her mother's death, she had a similar reaction. And so, while she was writing about the scene of being taken to her mother's deathbed, she wrote, and this is a quote, "I remember very clearly how even as I was taken to the bedside, I noticed that one nurse was sobbing, and a desire to laugh came over me. And I said to myself, as I have often done at moments of crisis since, I feel nothing whatsoever. Then I stooped and kissed my mother's face. It was still warm. She had only died a moment before." End of quote. Another example showing the other side of her ambivalence, that is, the love for her mother, can be seen in the following. And this is a quote. "The dead, so people say, are forgotten. But now and again, on more occasions than I can number, in bed at night, or in the street, or as I come into the room, there she is, beautiful, empathic, with her familiar phrase and her laugh, closer than any of the living are, lighting our random life as with a burning torch. Infinitely noble and delightful, to her children. End of quote. Think for a moment now the enormous confluence of conflicts that came to complicate her feelings about her mother in general and about her death in particular at this early age. To mention just a few, consider that 13 years old usually want in their unconscious fantasies to take the mother's place in the relationship to the father. That's a universal phenomenon. In fact, in a conversation with her sister Vanessa, many years after the death of her parents, she told her that as a child she loved her father much more than her mother. I never said that before. Add to this the many reasons she had to feel neglected by the mother and her unconscious wishes against her since early on, as you saw in her anxiety about mother being late, coming back at home, and the fantasy that she would have been killed in an accident that accompanied that anxiety. Further, add the pre-Oedipal needs for the mother as well as the Oedipal needs for her, clearly manifested as we will see in her relationship to her homosexual partner. She was bisexual, and if you want to call it that way. She had problems with her sexuality. As you know, she had married Leonard Woolf, but they have a non-functional marriage, and she had I think it was only one homosexual relationship or a homosexual partner, which you will see in a moment. It was a woman called Vita Sackville West, which was an aristocrat. That's Vita Sackville West. She was famous. She was too bisexual. She was married to a diplomat, an English diplomat. They were both bisexual. So it was a strange marriage in a way. And she was famous for seducing a married woman away from the husband and taking them with her. And she did that with Virginia. But Virginia was really not a sexual animal. Virginia was looking for a mother. And this woman could mother her and use her as a sexual object then in exchange for the mothering. So this Vita Sackville West, the woman in the picture, was given both the pre-Oedipal maternal role and the Oedipal role as her lover. Complete this picture by her mother's distinct preference for her younger brother Adrian, that the mother called Major all the time. Major, where is Major? And that irritated Virginia to know him. And you may start to realize the complexities that all this brought to dealing with her mother's death, let alone young adolescent's inability to mourn that I referred to already. Can you imagine her disappointment, her anger, her hostility, and the enormity of the conflict thus created, given on the other hand her immense love and need she had for her mother? Can you imagine the enormity of her guilt, particularly after her mother's death when she was 13? Had her anger killed her, killed the human being she loved so much as well, which is a common fantasy of children? 45 years after her mother's death, 45 years, she was to write, quote, "I hear the tinkle of her bracelets, made of twisted silver as she went about the house, especially as she came up at night to see if we were asleep, holding a candle shaded. This is a distinct memory, for like all children, I lay awake sometimes and longed for her to come. Then she told me to think of all the lovely things I could imagine, rainbows and bells," end of quote. That's a relationship to the mother. As you see, it's a very intense, very complicated relationship, and you will hear more about it in a moment in terms of how that influenced her life. The second point I wanted to make tonight is how the deaths of important people in rather traumatic circumstances and in a very rapid sequence, and given her talent for writing, led to lifelong attempts to mourn her mother, her father and brother, and Stella, and to keep her sanity. For this, I need to tell you about her writing, including the specific content of some of her novels. Virginia needs to write, for she had a need to write. It's a real need. Serve a multiplicity of purposes. Some are very clear and obvious. At times she wrote simply in order to earn the money they needed, she and Leonard Woolf, to cover the limited expenses and occasional luxuries, which were not many. But there was much more to her writing than utilitarian rationales. For tonight, I want to emphasize that writing was for her a form of healing, a curative process, something that gave meaning and substance to her life and kept her structured as a person. Thus, for example, in June of 1929, as she was reviewing with great care one of her novels called A Room of One's Own, she referred to how she had fished into her great lake of melancholy and was surprised as to its depth. Just talking about the passion that was overcoming her. She stated that, quote, "The only way I keep afloat to not become enormously depressed is working. A note for the summer. I must take more work than I can possibly get done. Directly I stop working, I feel that I am sinking down. End of quote. Some years later, in August of 1937, she wrote a similar statement, quote, "Directly I am not working or see the end in sight of what I am doing, then nothingness begins, the depression." End of quote. Writing was to an interminable form of mourning, by means of which she seemed to attempt to master the severe losses she suffered through her mother's, father's, and brother's death. By writing, she attempted to digest old and new traumas, to encounter meaning for herself, for life, and for others, to overcome primitive fears, to face unknown, to put handles on early anxieties, and so on, and you will see all of this very clearly. Writing was, for this extraordinarily intelligent woman, like experimental grounds where she could control events and variables. She was not at the mercy of life. She controlled life in her novels, consequently turning this activity into an invaluable evil aid. Writing was a way by means of which the child in her continued to be loved by her mother and admired by her father, and the adult in her loved, admired, and approved by her contemporaries. As a child, she wrote little plays and little stories and gave it to the mother and father that greatly admired them and encouraged them. Writing was uncommon, so she continued to do this. And in a way, it was a continuation of the child's wish to be admired and loved by the parents by this activity. Writing was an uncommon way of saying to her father, "I love you so much that I want to be like you were, a writer." Writing was a way of venting her hostile feelings towards that same father and to others by unconsciously saying, "I am in fact better than you were," than she was. Better than Toby was, better than Vanessa, better than Adrian. Writing was as well her way of saying to Vanessa, Toby, and Adrian, "I love you all." Writing was a way to keep the dead alive. They are all in the novels. All the novels are about these dead people, as you will see in a moment. So she was keeping all these dead people alive. Writing made her feel powerful, and indeed gave her a lot of power. Writing was agony and death, and writing was above all life for Virginia. No less important is the fact that most of what she wrote was autobiographical. For much that appears in her novels, there are life presence recorded in her letters and in her diary. In fact, nearly all is in her letters and her diaries and her memoirs. They are at times simply transposed more or less directly from there into the waves, which is a famous novel, or to the lighthouse, which was too a famous novel, I believe the first one she ever wrote. At other times, the personal biographical aspects may be more difficult to detect because they are not conscious, main transportations of which Virginia is perfectly aware and has intended. What I am trying to say is the fact that occasionally different part aspects of herself become isolated from the total, acquiring an independent life of their own and becoming a character, certain aspects of the personality, certain aspects of her image, and then that's developed into a full character. In this way, they become characters in her novels, representing in the literal sense aspects of herself, the biographical aspects of the characters, that her creative genius completed by adding to it her imagination. She rounded them. In this manner, in some novels, Virginia is actually represented by more than one of the characters in the book. This happened, for example, in the case of The Waves. The Waves is a very interesting novel. If you've never read it, I recommend it highly that you read it. It's a life history of a lot of people. It takes place from morning to evening, and people are born and die within these 24 hours and grow into adults and complete their life. It's an incredible novel which it did away with the conventions of time and passage of time and things of that kind. It's a unique novel. It's a wonderful novel. So, frequently, as I said, in some novels, Virginia may be represented by more than one of the characters in the novel, certain aspects of her. And that is typical of The Waves. She's there in many shapes and forms. Since Virginia was not doing this intentionally, it cannot be said that this was one of the conscious artifacts or techniques that one can find in the bag of tricks known to or favored by creative writers, or creative writers have a bag of tricks. This belongs then in one of the less conscious or clearly defined bags of tricks that every author possesses. It is such things, actually, that give writers style, a character, a definition, a kind of signature, and makes them unique and distinct from any other author. The same seems to be true in the case of gifted poets, composers, painters, sculptors, and the like. Consider now the following facts. In many of his novels, there is an orphan girl. Many of her novels. In The Voyage Out, written in 1915, there is an orphan girl. In Night and Day, written in 1919, there is an orphan girl. In Mrs. Dalloway, written in 1925, there is an orphan girl. And so it goes. Alternative, in The Waves, which I just mentioned, written in 1931, there is an orphan girl as well. Alternatively, the death of her mother was dramatized in some of her novels, such as Into the Lighthouse and In the Waves as well. Similarly, the death of her brother Toby was recreated in two of her novels. One was Jekyll's Room, that he wrote in 1922, and The Waves in 1937. Jekyll's Room is a description of a room, somebody who is never in the novel, is dead, is not dead, but it's influenced the life of everybody. And she describes this beautifully. It's Toby, it's clearly Toby, who is now dead, and yet is an enormous influence, not only in her life, but in the life of all of her friends, and the very famous Bloomsbury group. It became internationally famous, this group of people. Now, in The Waves, Percival, which is one of the characters, is Toby, clearly Toby. And Percival is dead in the novel. He's not alive, he's dead. And yet, he's omnipresent everywhere and influences everybody. which is what happened to these people after Toby's death. Her sister Vanessa had immediately recognized that this novel was a monument to the brothers Toby in the form of Percival in the novel. She wrote to Virginia, this is a quote from Vanessa, letter to Virginia, "You have found a lullaby capable of singing him to rest," end of quote. It's a beautiful quote. Similarly, in Jacob's room, written 15 years before The Waves, that was written in 1937, Jacob, who is actually dead and never appears in the novel, represents her brother Toby. Both books can be considered attempts at dealing with Toby's death and are memorials to him. Virginia output was prodigious. She wrote about 20 novels. She didn't live that long. Remember, she committed suicide. There are 4 volumes of her letters, big volumes of her letters to friends, relatives, and so on, as well as 4 volumes of her personal diaries, plus 4 volumes of critical essays. Beyond this, she wrote a large amount of short stories, now collected under various titles, several books, among which I must highlight for you one she wrote called The Death of the Moth. I don't know if you have read it. If you haven't, please go and read it. It will move you to tears. The Death of the Moth, where she beautifully describes death as an inexorable enemy, an overwhelming force that overcomes the struggling moth. She wrote that because she saw a moth dying in the window frame of her house, and the struggle of the moth as she was dying, and then she retranslated that into death as the enemy of life and humans. Remember, she lost a lot of people to death. She herself was attracted by death when she became depressed. Let me give you some further evidence in Virginia's own words on how writing was a form of mourning, a curative process, an ego aid for her. And remember what I told you, that adolescents cannot mourn. They are not able to do that. So this was her way of mourning later on in life. This is a quote, and it came from something that she wrote called Moments of Being, which is part, it's a book that she wrote so that she didn't have any children, but so that her nephews and nieces will know about the family and what happened to her and to the rest of the family and so on. It's called Moments of Being. It's a very interesting book. This is a quote. She says, quote, "Until I was in the 40s, remember, the mother died when she was 13, that's 27 years later, the presence of my mother obsessed me. I could hear her voice, see her, and imagine what she would do or say as I went about my days doing. She was one of the invisible presences who, after all, play so important part in every life. It is perfectly true that she obsessed me, in spite of the fact that she died when I was 13, until I was 44. Then one day, walking around Tavistock Square, I made up, as I sometimes make my books, to the lighthouse. In a great, apparently involuntary rush, just came to her, in what she described as an involuntary rush. One thing bursts into another, blowing bubbles out of a pipe, gives the feeling of a rapid crowd of ideas and scenes which blew out of my mind, so that my lips seemed syllabling of their own accord as I walk. What blew the bubbles? Why then? I have no notion. But I wrote the book very quickly, and when it was written, I ceased to be obsessed by my mother. I no longer hear her voice. I do not see her anymore. I suppose, she continues, I did for myself what psychoanalysts do for their patients. Remember, she knew a lot about psychoanalysis because her brother had become an analyst. So she says, I suppose I did for myself what psychoanalysts do for their patients. I expressed some very long felt and deeply felt emotion. And in expressing it, I explain it and then lay it to rest. But what is the meaning of explain? Of explaining it? Why? Because I describe her. My feeling for her became so much dimmer and weaker. At the end of quote. You see, Virginia and her husband, when they got married, that's Lena Woolf, that's her. That's Virginia at around this time that she wrote The Moments of Being. You see, she has already some white hair on her and looks much more like a more mature kind of lady. These moments of being, these memoirs, the parts concerning her mother were written 2 or 3 years before her suicide in 1941. So she wrote this in about 1938 or 39. She was, through writing to the lighthouse, able to reconcile her hostility, her anger, and the resentment to her mother, at least to a degree that allowed Virginia to let her mother go and be dead. She was not able to do that before. To mourn her. To the lighthouse novel was the only way she could do it, allí, in a display symbolic form. Let me mention to you what she had to say in this regard in 1939, 2 years before her suicide. Quote, and you remember what I told you about the difficulties and the anger that she had for her mother and the reason for that anger. This is a quote. I see now that she was living on such an extended surface that she had no time nor strength to concentrate, except for a moment, if one were ill or in some child's crisis, upon me or upon anyone else unless it were Adrian. Him she cherished separately. She called him my joy. The latter view, the understanding that I now have of her position, must have its say. And it shows me that a woman of 40 with 7 children, some of them needing grown-up attention, and an aged child, Laura, an idiot, yet living with us, and a husband 15 years elder, difficult, exacting, dependent on her. I see now that a woman that had to keep all this in being and under control must have been a general presence rather than a particular person to a child of 7 or 8. Can I remember ever being alone with her for more than a few minutes? Someone was always interrupting. When I think of her spontaneously, she's always in a room full of people. Stella, her half-sister, George and Gerald, half-brothers, are there. My father, sitting, reading with one leg curved round the other, twisting his lock of hair. You remember he had long hair. Go and take the crumbs out of his bed, the mother will say to her. And off I trot. There are visitors, young men like Jack Hills, who is in love with Stella, many young men, Cambridge friends of George and Gerald's, all men sitting round the tea table talking, father's friends, Henry James, Simmons. I hear jokes, laughter, the clatter of voices. I am teased. I say something funny. She laughs. I am pleased. I blush furiously, she observes. End of quote. In Virginia Woolf's diary, on Wednesday 28th of 1928, one can read, quote, I used to think of him and mother daily, but writing to the lighthouse placed them in my mind. And now he comes back sometimes, but differently. I I believe this to be true, that I was obsessed by them both unhealthily, and writing of them was a necessary act. He comes back now more as a contemporary. I must read him someday. I wonder if I can feel again. I hear his voice. I know this by heart. Let me tell you about one of the novels. Any one of them could be used as an example. I just chose this one for no particular reason. You could use any one of them. And of course, remember what I told you, I'm just scratching the surface of her life. This is called Mrs. Dalloway. In fact, these two novels that I'm going to tell you a little bit about. One is Mrs. Dalloway and the other is The Way, but mostly Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia's writing has, as we have seen, very many different purposes and aims. We will try to show you in Mrs. Dalloway how she recapitulated in the novel her developmental experiences and problems, her unresolved conflicts, her many traumatic losses, her ambivalence, her hostility, her attempts at money, her identity problems, and her unnamed dissatisfaction, such as with marriage. In doing so, we will highlight as well her many efforts at working through these various problems, these unresolved vital questions that preoccupy her perennially. What we will note in Mrs. Dalloway applies to all of her novels. You will find the same items in all of her novels. Working through is a psychoanalytic concept that implies taking a new look at the same problem once and again, indeed as many times as it may be necessary to understand a particular problem or to master it. And you will not fail to notice the similarity of working through in treatment with mourning. Mourning is a similar job. You look at the same event, up, right, down, left, one time, 100 times, until finally it becomes kind of neutralized and it's not painful anymore, and you can put it to rest, and that's what working through is as well. This is done, this working through is done from as many angles and points of view as possible, considering now one aspect, now another. That's what you do in mourning. By such means, some resolutions are achieved that help to take hold of the conflicts, or at least to place useful handles on them that help to control and modulate the anxieties that are their derivatives. In this way, it is occasionally possible to achieve some internal peace or to come to terms with one's fate, accepting what was previously unacceptable. As a consequence, one gets unstuck and becomes more flexible, more able to look forward and to move in progressive directions. It becomes possible as well to leave the past behind and to accept the risk of the future. This working through this mourning process was in fact one of Virginia's life tasks. It never ended. Given that she possessed such a creative genius, she could turn the past and its traumas and her attempts to come to terms with them into valuable literary pieces and on occasion substantial literary jewels. It seemed possible that Virginia was, in fact, in this regard a paradigm, and perhaps even somewhat unique. She was certainly aware of this and had one asked herself, quote, "Have I the power of conveying the true reality, or do I write essays about myself?" End of quote. Mrs. Dalloway is no exception to the rule. In this novel, as in many others, Virginia uses one or another of the characters in the novel to be the carriers of some of the major difficulties experienced by herself all through her life. In Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa represents parts of Virginia, while Septimus, these are two characters in the novel, Clarissa and Septimus, Clarissa is a woman, Septimus is a man. While Septimus portrays her madness and suicidality. Similarly, other characters in this novel stand for figures in Virginia life such as Lytton Strachey, represented in Mrs. Dalloway by a man called Peter Walsh in the novel, or her husband Leonard, represented by Mr. Richard Dalloway, Clarissa's husband in the novel. Other less well-defined personages such as Sally Seton, a friend of hers, to whom in the novel Clarissa is homosexually attracted, seem to represent at one and the same time those women on whom Virginia had had a homosexual interest. That is Violet Dickinson, Madge Bahan, and Vita Sackville West, with whom she actually had a homosexual relationship. It is similarly possible to identify certain specific themes, some of which are repeated through much of her life work in one form or another. In Mrs. Dalloway, we detect her disappointment at Lytton Strachey's withdrawal of his marriage proposal to her. Lytton Strachey has proposed marriage to her early on in her life, and you will see how important this was to her. There is too the dissatisfaction with her marriage and her husband Leonard, so rarely expressed in her real life. The question of her not having children, and the lifelong preoccupation with death and suicide. One finds in this novel as well the problems with her sexual identity and her homosexual proclivities. You see clearly stated the anger she felt for the physicians that took care of her when she was mentally ill. During her manic depressive episode, because of the ignorance, the pretentiousness, intrusiveness, and power. And given the times in which this what happened, all of this is true. In Mrs. Dalloway, there was no treatment for her condition. In fact, they didn't even diagnose her appropriately. Had they diagnosed her, there was no treatment for the condition at that time. In Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa, the main protagonist in the novel, had early on an intense attachment to her sweetheart, Peter Walsh. Clarissa describes him as unreliable, ineffectual in some ways, but at the same time as the man to whom she felt the most attracted. Peter Walsh had the ability to make her feel totally at ease, something that no other man could do for Clarissa in the novel. Communication between them was so smooth that frequently required no words, just a mere presence of both of them. Naturally, Clarissa recalled one or another of these things at many points in her life and came to very much regret having rejected him early on. In the novel, Clarissa rejects Paul Walsh early on in her life, then she regrets it. This scenario corresponds exactly with Virginia's description of her friend and fellow writer, Lytton Strachey, that had proposed marriage to her. She felt that between the two of them, and she had written about this many times, there were no communication barriers. It was like with Clarissa and Peter Walsh, exactly the same. No communication barriers. And she repeatedly stated that no one ever made her feel as comfortable and at ease as Lytton did. Lytton, incidentally, was strictly homosexual, yet he proposed marriage to Virginia rather impulsively and immediately afterwards fell into a panic state. The panic was based on the fear that she would make heterosexual demands on him. Thus, he requested to be released from this commitment. This Virginia did graciously, though reluctantly. Nevertheless, one can find in her diary and letters through the years many loving and positive references to him. She would have happily married him. She was not a sexual animal, as I told you. In the novel, Mrs. Dalloway, it is Clarissa, the main protagonist in the novel, that rejects Peter Walsh a reversal of what actually happened to Virginia. Such reversal is not an uncommon technical and disguising device used by her. She does that frequently. Significantly, Virginia made Peter Walsh into a heterosexual being that had married not once but twice. Yet, simultaneously she described Peter Walsh in the novel as not totally manly, further establishing the link with Lytton's station. She wrote that Peter was, quote, attractive to women who liked the things that he was not altogether manly. She described Peter as furiously jealous when his wife Daisy showed an interest in anyone else. And this is a quote from the novel. For he was jealous, uncontrollably jealous by temperament. He suffered tortures, end of quote. Here too, there is a hidden allusion to Lytton's character. Lytton was certainly uncontrollably jealous and suffered great tortures on this account. The only difference was that such feelings were addressed to the male with whom he had fallen in love. But it was exactly the same phenomenon. Clarissa in the novel feels jealous, annoyed and rejected when Peter gets married. Lytton himself was never married, but nevertheless there is to be found a close parallel here. There was in reality a young female artist by the name of Dora Carrington who was madly in love with Lytton, and as such was willing to do anything for him. Indeed, she took care of him as a companion and housekeeper for many years. This was a ménage à trois that included Dora Carrington's husband, Ralph Partridge. This peculiar kind of arrangement was to last many years till Lytton's death in January of 1932. 10 weeks later, Dora Carrington, who was devastated by Lytton's loss, shot herself and died. How attached she was to him, though she was married to a different man. And Lytton was a homosexual. We know from Virginia's diary and letters that she felt jealous of this girl, so much so that she managed at least once to get Lytton to reassure her that she was more important to him than Dora Carrington, which of course delighted her. There was never in any case anything sexual between Lytton and Dora Carrington. Pankin, in the book Virginia Woolf and the Laws of Creation, written in 1997, pointed out how in his characterizations and imagery, quote, the novel represents deep-seated and unresolved conflicts of the author, end of quote, expressed through the characters of Septimus and Clarissa. She sees too the theme of failed marriage as linking Clarissa, Septimus, and Virginia. Clarissa's marriage to Richard Dalloway was certainly not successful in the novel. We mentioned already how she had many times regretted having rejected Peter Walsh. Indeed, Richard was involved with other women, something that Clarissa was well aware of, another reversal, since it was Virginia that was involved with female lovers during her marriage. And Leonard knew that. The marriage had deteriorated in the novel to the point that it included no sexual interaction between them, which was indeed the case of Virginia and Leonard for all of their married lives. They never consummated that marriage. Don't you see, this is an autobiographical novel. In the novel, Richard Dalloway is a member of Parliament, the English Parliament, and is completely absorbed by the business of politics and government. Interestingly enough, Leonard, Virginia's husband, in actual life had run once for a seat in Parliament, but was defeated and never tried again. Nevertheless, Leonard was a political animal, and he continued to be very active and closely involved in politics and political action. Several of his books testify to his interest in this regard, as did the League of Nations. to the formation of which he contributed very significantly. In Mrs. Dalloway, one of Septimus' crimes, Septimus was mad in Mrs. Dalloway, he was crazy, was delusional, wanted to kill himself. And that's Virginia madness, called Septimus. And you will see. For which he felt he had, Septimus, one of Septimus' crimes for which he felt he had to be punished, including his having lied to his wife, Recia. He had pretended to love her in order to get married, when in fact he was not in love with her. We know the initial vicissitudes of Lerna's and Virginia's relationship and courting. Virginia did not completely lie to Lerner, as Septimus had to Recia in the novel. In fact, she plainly confronted him with the fact that she didn't love him, that he let her cold. In spite of this, shortly afterwards she married him. I believe that Virginia felt this marriage was one of her crimes for having deceived Leonard in spite of a fair warning. This was certainly true in terms of her homosexual inclinations and her general sexual coldness towards men. Septimus felt that such crimes, and for such crimes, he deserved to die. We know that this was the way Virginia felt during those periods in which the depression overtook her. She deserved to die. At such times, she was full of self-accusations, like Septimus' marriage. Virginia had represented to a large extent an escape, an attempt to conform, a way to deal with her loneliness, particularly the Vanessa marriage, and a way to deny her homosexual difficulties. She did not love Leonard, and told him so. Leonard didn't care. He was passionately interested in her. And there are complications to this. He was passionately interested in Toby. The best he could get was her sister. His sister. Septimus' marriage to Recia was as well an attempt to bury then the homosexual feelings for Evans, his officer, while in the army. Septimus was in the army once, and there was an officer there with whom he had fallen in love. It was Evans' death that he did not allow himself to feel something that he considered another of his major crimes. One cannot escape here a certain similarity with Virginia's behavior when at her mother's death she had denied any feelings at first and then felt like laughing. You remember what I described to you a moment ago. But when for which she pretended to Violet Dickinson that her brother Toby was not dead. Her brother had died and she was writing to this woman. He was alive and getting better and riding horses, and she did that for quite a long time. Quite a long time. Or when guilt overcame her after the death of her father, whom she felt she had not treated properly. You remember she went into a severe depression immediately after and made a suicidal attempt. And one of the things that she was, manifesting in her depression was the fact that she had not behaved properly toward her father, and she deserved to die for this. These various events are no doubt similar to Septimus' crimes, at an unconscious level a great source of conflicts and guilt for Virginia. This novel is as well another monument to death and suicide. In the novel, Septimus' suicide by jumping out of a building. She jumped out of buildings several times. Though at least once he had contemplated death by drowning in a river. This is important. It's the way Virginia killed herself. Septimus said to his wife, quote, in the novel, "Now we will kill ourselves," end of quote, when they were standing by the river, and, quote, he looked at it with a look which she had seen in his eyes when a train went by or an omnibus. A look as if something fascinated him and she felt he was going from her, and she caught him by the arm. End of quote. That's a quote from the novel. Mrs. Dalloway is depicted as very preoccupied with suicide and death. Suicide occurs as well in The Waves, published in 1931. In this case, it is Rhoda, one of the characters in the novel, who commits suicide by jumping. The character describing Rhoda's death said, "I see far away, quivering like a gold thread, the pillar Rhoda saw, and feel the rush of the wind of her flight when she leapt." End of quote. The character of Septimus in Mrs. Dalloway is a composite. He's made up of certain aspects of Virginia's own self. Indeed, the sickest part of her, it is of significance that she chose Septimus as the name of the person that is to represent her. Septimus is the Latin word for seventh. And you will remember that she was the seventh child in a family of 8 siblings. She's named Septimus. Septimus' delusions and hallucinations are exactly the delusions and hallucinations that Virginia described in her diary that she suffered when she was 13. We know too that Septimus' madness was modeled in Virginia's own madness. Indeed, Septimus' delusions and thought disorders are pretty much those that Virginia herself has suffered. Like Virginia, Septimus heard, and this is part of the delusion that Virginia had at the time when she went mad. Septimus heard the sparrows, quote, sing freshly and personally in Greek words. That's what happened to her. There were sparrows singing in Greek words outside her window. Interestingly enough, in his delusional state, Septimus heard the voices of other sparrows singing in Greek, quote, from trees in the meadow of life beyond a river where the dead walk, how there is no death. End of quote. This passage perhaps points out the fact that Septimus, like Virginia, could not accept, understand, or master the meaning, if any, and the trauma of death, of which she had been exposed many times, to the many deaths in her family in quick succession. Like her, in his delusional condition, death had to be denied. It did not really exist. It was all a part of that deeper and much greater understanding of life that they believed to have achieved while they were both mad. It's a better understanding of life, and in that understanding, death was not real. That death did not exist can only be affirmed in the midst of one's madness. In one's rational states, one tries to cope with it, to give it meaning and context, even if sometimes one simultaneously manages by some mechanism or another to have denied, unbelieved it, or ignored it. Yet its imperative was what possibly led Virginia's psyche to turn something fearful and traumatic into something that became suddenly interesting. Death was no longer frightening, it was interesting, and it really did not exist. So it was interesting, exciting, liberating, and defiant. It is sort of a valiant attempt to turn the indignity of death, to which we must submit passively, into an active, challenging act of protest. Death was turned to life. Thus in The Waves that chronicle so many deaths, Percivals, Rhodas, Bernards, all of these people died, ends by declaring, death is the enemy. It is death, and this is a quote, against whom I side with my spear couched and my hair flying back like a Jones man, like Percival, which is a brother in this novel. He's galloping in a horse. When he galloped in India, I strike spurs into my horse. Against you I will fling myself, unvanquished and unyielded, for death. End of quote. That's the last sentence in the book. That Virginia madness and anger at the pompous and ignorant daughters of her times who control every second of her life and attended her during her illness had been transposed to Septimus can be clearly substantiated. And she wrote about this in her diaries many times. She was mad at these people. The treatments in those days were horrendous, and they were in isolation. They were horrendous. Indeed, what led Septimus to commit suicide in Mrs. Dalloway, the novel, were likely the very reasons that in her depressed condition led her to kill herself. Virginia was terrified of being sent away for cure to a sanatorium, as had been done in the past on several occasions. She was even more terrified of having every instant of her life controlled and regimented. We know this from her letters to her friends, the painter Jacques Raverard and his wife Gwen, to whom she had sent the proof of Mrs. Dalloway. This was in itself very unusual behavior on Virginia's part, since she hardly ever allowed anybody but Leonard to read her work before publication. Perhaps it was that Jacques was dying at that time. He was dying too, really dying, and he did die a few days later. And this was Virginia's way of showing her special affection for him. Be that as it may, Jacques read Mrs. Dalloway just a few days before dying. He liked it a lot and wrote Virginia to that effect, something that gave her much pleasure. In condoling with Gwen, this man's wife, a couple of months later she wrote, quote, "What you say about Mrs. Dalloway is exactly what I was after. It was a subject that I have kept cooling in my mind until I felt I could touch it without bursting into flames all over. You cannot think what a raging furnace it is still to me, madness and doctors and being forced. But let's change the subject." End of quote. That's the letter that she wrote to Jack's wife. To Ethel Smith, woman that was interested in her, nearly 8 years later in 1930, she was still to write angrily on the same subject. Indeed, this is a quote, "I was almost crippled when I came back to the world from the sanatorium, unable to move a foot in terror after that discipline. Think, not one moment freedom from doctor's discipline, perfectly strange, conventional men. You shan't read this, and you shan't write a word, and you shall lie still and drink milk for 6 months." End of quote. That was the treatment. Virginia used quite literally her own delusional spirits, her own suicidal tendency, her fear of doctors, and their power to send you to a sanatorium, and so on, to describe Septimus' illness and behavior. She described this in Septimus, all that happened to her. We already mentioned how Septimus means seventh, and how Virginia was the seventh child of her family. Whether she chose this name consciously or whether it was an unconscious occurrence, we cannot really say. It certainly could have been either, but we did not find anywhere in her diaries or letters anything suggesting that this was a conscious choice. Similarly, we should know that Septimus Warren Smith is 31 years old when he committed suicide. Virginia herself, at age 31, had made a very serious suicide attempt that miraculously she survived. She took about 100 grains of Veronal on that occasion. I mentioned this earlier. Septimus' suicide was by jumping out of a window when Dr. Holmes, the psychiatrist, came to see him. He ended in pulp on the rails below. We need to remember that in an early suicide attempt, Virginia had jumped more than one occasion from a window, though fortunately she suffered no damage. Clarissa Dalloway, incidentally, is described as constantly preoccupied with death, as indeed was Virginia. Finally, we will call your attention to the fact that Septimus, like Virginia, was terrified of being sent away to a sanatorium, feeling unable to tolerate the separation from his family. He resented, as this Virginia, the brutal control exercised over patients by the doctors. In Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia makes Recia state that, quote, if they took him, she would go too. They could not separate them against their wills, end of quote, she said. Here there is an implicit accusation of Leonard, her husband, and Vanessa, her sister, who allowed her to be taken away to these horrible places. In very many occasions, she has expressed very strong feelings about this. Indeed, according to Virginia's description, Septimus didn't really want to die. This is a quote of what Septimus said at the time. Life was good, he said. He thought, but he couldn't tolerate being taken away, being in prison. 16 years later, Virginia found herself in the same situation as Septimus. The immediate prospect of being hospitalized was right upon her. She, like Septimus, in a final defiant act, chose not to be in prison. As to the third point, and we are nearly the end, I want to, because she's suicide, I wanted to discuss. She seemed to have lived a significant part of her life in a hypomanic state. She was most of the time very hypomanic. During such times, she was full of ideas and highly creative. Those that knew her have said that she kept you in stitches all the time, laughing all the time. At such times, she wrote rapidly and things flow easily. Occasionally, these hypomanic states went out of control and she became temporarily psychotic, hallucinated and delusional, and at some points homicidal towards her husband Leonard. During such episodes, she was hospitalized for months on end. She dreaded the hospitalization as much as she dreaded the episodes of depression, when she couldn't write or hardly do so. Then she will take to her bed. During these various episodes of depression, there were suicidal attempts, mostly severe, that culminated in the last one when she drowned herself in the river house. Just to finish, let me tell you about her illness at the end of suicide. I personally had concluded, after carefully considering Virginia's life and the accounts of the various episodes of her illness and suicide attempts as given by herself, Leonard, and others, that she suffered from a manic depressive illness. Remember, she was not diagnosed during her lifetime. Yet she was never so diagnosed. Indeed, Dr. Savage, her first psychiatrist, all know his name, and several other distinguished specialists argued inexplicably against such a diagnosis, asserting that she was not manic depressive but neurasthenic, which is something that we don't recognize nowadays, but in those days it was a diagnosis. Leonard, in his autobiography written years after her death, remarked that in his judgment, Virginia had suffered from manic depressive illness. This is Virginia, incidentally, toward the end of her life. All of her life, he thought she had suffered from manic depressive illness. The evidence available then, and whatever has surfaced since, strongly supports that position. First, there is a family history on her father's side of manic depressive illness. There was manic depressive illness in the family. There was, for example, Virginia's first cousin, Jean Kenneth Stevens, the son of her paternal uncle, who first became sick around 1886. Up to that time, this had been a young, healthy, prominent, powerful, and genial figure. He had been a tremendous success at Eton as a scholar and an athlete, finally becoming a fellow at his college. He was also the author of ingenious verses, which in the day were very popular. Virginia, in her moments of being, described him as having gone mad and being in a very exalted stage. He came frequently to Virginia's house looking for Stella, with whom he felt very infatuated. His behavior was so inappropriate that the family started to tell him that Stella had gone away. Sometimes he would hire a hansom and drive all day about London, that's a carriage, in an excited mood, spending perhaps a sovereign, that was a lot of money, and extravagance in those days, then asking his Uncle Leslie to pay for it. Virginia recounted how he once dashed up to the nursery and speared the bread with a sword, or how suddenly he became a painter and painted Virginia in a small bit of wood. He was always in a state of great euphoria. She said, I suppose, this is a quote, madness made him believe he was all powerful. Once he came in at breakfast saying, Savage, the doctor, which had been Virginia's doctor too, was a well-known psychiatric specialist of the time, has just told me, I am in danger of dying or going mad, he laughed. And soon he ran naked through Cambridge, was taken to an asylum and died. Those days people with manic illness died of exhaustion. Will you believe it? It seemed reasonable to conclude that he was suffering from manic episode, though the family believed that the young man's change in character and behavior were due to a minor accident that supposedly had damaged his head during a visit to Felixstowe in 1886. Her own father, Virginia's father, Leslie, had some episodical crisis where he could be said to be suffering from a mild delusion of ruin. At such times he became quite agitated and nearly convinced himself that he and his family would end in the poorhouse. There was never any real reason for such concern, but he could drive himself and his children to distraction with this anxiety. There is, of course, a very well-known form of depressive illness where delusions of ruin play a very prominent role. The considerable amount of information available about Virginia's illnesses is largely due to Leonard's meticulousness and extraordinary devotion to her. This is Leonard later on in life. He kept careful notes about her health for 30 years, and though not a medical person himself, he was both an excellent and concerned observer. He described episodes that will suggest that she was suffering from what will be called nowadays an agitated type of depression, since she seemed to be by turns deeply depressed and violently excited, as is generally the case in the agitated variety. These were followed on occasion by a second stage, the manic period, of her illness, which was at times prolonged and very severe. This is how they look at the time of her suicide. In her last episode, in her despair and hopelessness, she wrote to Leonard, explaining that she was hearing voices, was going mad, and would not be able to recover this time. She didn't want to continue to ruin his life. From her garden studio, where she used to write, she went into the main house and wrote again to Leonard the following letter. Quote, Dearest, I feel certain I'm going mad again. I feel we cannot go through another one of these terrible times, and I shan't recover this time. I begin to hear voices and I cannot concentrate. So I am doing what seems the best thing to do. You have given me the best possible happiness. You have been in every way all that anyone could be. I don't think two people could have been happier till this terrible disease came. I cannot fight it any longer. I know that I am spoiling your life, that without me you could work, and you will, I know. You see, I cannot even write this properly. I cannot read. What I want to say is I owe all the happiness of my life to you. You have been entirely patient with me and incredibly good. I want to say that everybody knows it. If anybody could have saved me, it would have been you. Everything has gone from me but the certainty of your goodness. I cannot go on spoiling your life any longer. I don't think two people could have been happier than we have been. End of quote. It was 11:30 in the morning. She placed the second letter on the mantelpiece, took her walking stick and made her way to the River Ouse. Once there, she placed heavy stones in her coat pockets and drowned herself. Lena found her stick, but her body was not found until 3 weeks later. He recalled how a few days earlier Virginia had been late returning home from her walk. Anxiously, he went looking for her and found her, all wet, walking towards the house. She said that she had fallen in the water accidentally. In retrospect, Lena concluded that Virginia may have made an unsuccessful suicidal attempt that day. She was finally cremated on the 21st of April. Lena buried her ashes beneath an elm in Monk's House Garden, which is what you see now. This is Monk's House Garden. You see a picture of it. This is a cottage that they have in the countryside where she spent much of her time, and so did Lena, and where she wrote much of her novels and essays and things like that. She built a studio in there, and the river was very near here. It was a village outside London. Life in London was very difficult for her. So that's essentially what I wanted to show you today. And as you see, it's a very interesting life. It's a very sad life. Very productive life, and you see the enormous struggle that this enormously talented lady had in trying to cope with the many catastrophes in her life, starting with the death of her mother when she was a very young adolescent girl, and the quick succession of losses that she suffered. So I hope you have better knowledge of Virginia Woolf. If you have any questions about her, I'll try to give you an answer if I know it.